Ronan, I'll come to yourself first. You've long been an opponent of this legislation. What are the problems with it as you see it?
The problem is that freedom of expression is a really important thing in our society. And if you try to restrict it, sometimes you have to restrict it, but you only do so when you do it in a very carefully defined way. You certainly don't introduce vague terms. You don't make it, you don't leave people wondering, am I likely to be prosecuted if I dare to, express a view robustly on social media? You don't create the possibility that social media companies might be taking people's stuff down even without people ever having a chance to speak, because activist groups are saying, oh, that's hate speech, you're not allowed to talk about this, you're not allowed to talk about that. I think what we've seen in recent times, and we discovered it in particular at the referendums, that people are fed up of a government that they see as out of touch, as being obsessed by kind of culture war type of issues to the neglect of bread and butter issues, and overly influenced by some NGOs in the background around things like gender policy and so on.
Vague terms, are you talking about the term hate?
Well, the fact that hatred isn't defined, it wasn't defined in the 1989 legislation either, but in that legislation you had clear indicator words like threatening, abusive, or insulting. People had to be likely to be stirring up hatred. The minister on one occasion clearly admitted, we don't want to define this because we want to get more prosecutions. Now I think that's a very dangerous mentality for government to be showing, because freedom of speech matters.
Patrick?
Freedom of speech absolutely matters, which is why it's clearly protected in this bill. There are clear carve-outs and defences for freedom of speech, for contributions to discourse, for legitimate criticism. All of those protections are in there. And beyond that, there's the protections that are in the Constitution, the protections that are in the European Convention. They're still there. Freedom of speech is important, and this bill continues to protect that. What it doesn't protect is incitement to violence. And it's not just about speech, but it's about wider hate crimes as well. There is a consistent trend in reported numbers of Gardaí, numbers reported by Gardaí of hate crimes increasing. And hate crimes are a cancer. All right, so when you say hate crimes, and we're talking about hate speech as well, what do you mean by hate, and why is it that there is no definition in this legislation of hate? Well, as Ronan says, there's no definition in the 1989 Act either, and the Act clearly talks about incitement to violence and sets that kind of high bar, because the reality is that what we are dealing with here is a message crime, essentially. If somebody is targeted because of who they are, because of their race, their religion, their gender, and they are on the receiving end of violence or threats or intimidation or harassment because of that, it sends a message to everybody who's part of that community.
Does it have to be those things that you've just listed there, threats, intimidation, violence? Does it have to be all that, or can it be just something really, really insulting directed at somebody because of a particular characteristic?
The bill clearly says that criticism will be allowed, that freedom of speech will be protected, that freedom of expression will be protected. So no, simply insulting somebody is not going to be enough.
Ronan, you can be as offensive as you like.
No, I don't think so, and people shouldn't be left wondering whether they're going to get a knock on the door from the Garda who says, you can't really say this. You see, the danger is, this need never go to court. It's the process that becomes the punishment when there is a chilling effect on people's right to communicate. So let's say you have a parent who's extremely upset that a man who is presenting as a woman is going into the classroom kind of spouting trans ideology, and they let rip in no uncertain terms online. You can be sure there's people going to say, oh, you're a hater, you're breaking the law, pressure then coming on the Gardaí. Just to give one example, there were 55,000 thefts and 22,000 assaults in 2022. There were only a couple of hundred, maybe 500 things that were defined as hate crime. And by the way, there's no problem with the hate crime part of the bill. There were only 72 non-crime hate incidents. The problem with so little to be obsessing the government, and even those 72 are based on a subjective test where the Gardaí call it a hate incident, they don't even call it an allegation, but it could be based on somebody's perception, oh, this is motivated by hatred. The danger is that without a definition of hatred in the bill, that's exactly the kind of low standard that the Gardaí feel that they have to act on.
On that point, Patrick, who decides when something is hate, when something goes beyond the line of being offensive and goes into hate?
Well, I think just to pick up on one point there, the numbers of hate crimes are very low at the minute, but that's because we have a huge problem of underreporting. Research has shown that at every stage, from when the crime is committed to when the judge sentences, at every point, the hate element, the prejudice element, and the wider toxic nature of that falls away. So this is another reason why we need to update the 1999
and to my question,
Act.
who decides when it moves beyond offensive to hate?
Well, I think there is a clear line in the bill in terms of protecting free speech, protecting freedom of expression, and it is about where that moves into incitement to violence, where that is a threat to somebody. So I don't think, though, the example Ronan gave would really qualify under the bill.
So if somebody goes online and gives out in very strong terms about a transgender woman going into a girl's bathroom,
what the bill says is that if there is legitimate criticism, that will be accepted.
I suppose that's my question. Who decides what's legitimate criticism? That's really where we're at here.
Ultimately, I guess it's going to have to be a jury who decides some of this, and it's a jury of the peers.
So you could end up in court before that decision's made.
There's going to be lots of, as with any crime, there will be guidance to prosecutors. There will be a Garda making an assessment, a DPP making an assessment, and I think there is the legislation provides enough defences and enough carve-outs to protect legitimate criticism.
I want to ask you, Patrick, very briefly, and I'll get back to yourself, Ronan, then about Section 10. A lot of concerns Patrick raised about Section 10 in this legislation, which creates this whole new offence whereby if you're preparing or possessing material that is likely to incite violence or hatred, and even if you haven't disseminated that material yet, you could be found guilty of an offence. And another part of that section says where it's proved that the accused person was in possession of material and it's reasonable to assume that that material was not intended for personal use, the person shall be presumed until the contrary is proved to have been in possession of the material in contravention of the law. That sounds to me like presumed guilty until proven innocent.
No, that kind of presumption is a rebuttable presumption. That's in a lot of offences, like theft offences, like firearms offences. If you are found with tools that can be used for a break-in, it's assumed you're going to use them for a break-in, but it's not an automatic assumption of guilt because you can then go into court and as part of your defence rebut that.
Okay.
So
Ronan, do you think that section is workable?
Not as it stands. Those kind of powers belong in drug-related offences, not with laws that deal with people shooting their mouth off. What needs to happen here, very clearly, Sarah, is first of all, there's no problem with the hate offences part of the bill, which is basically where if somebody commits what's already a crime and they do it for a hate motive, that's fine. There's no problem with incitement to violence, Patrick. Everybody is clear. So the government could go with that bill part, but go back to the drawing board, not just with a definition of hatred needed, but this strange and weird new definition of gender, which seems to have been very deliberate, and I think is part of the motivation for this bill, which is meant to shut down people who are very critical of the type of ideology that is driving, I'm sorry to say, the Green Party in government, but being enabled by the Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil party. That has to change. They need to get back to bread and butter issues.
But that's just not true. The reality is our existing legislation is not doing enough to protect vulnerable minorities who are being very deliberately targeted with hate and violence and incitement to violence. And the bill is not good enough. The current legislation is not good enough. And this is an update on existing legislation. Many of the things in this already exist in the 1989 Act.
We have to leave it there. Thank you both very much for joining us. Miriam.